Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. Folks, I'm so excited today to be joined by Ari Levin. Ari is a sports writer and the assistant managing editor at the Rio Grande Sun in Española, New Mexico. We both know each other because we overlapped in our time in the Northwoods League back in the summer of 2018 when I was the voice of the Lacrosse Loggers and he was one of the voices of the Duluth Huskies. So I'm very excited to be joined by him today. Of course, it's like I said, 6 years ago, Ari. It's hard to believe, time flies. But thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun that summer. I still follow um some of the players. Was there someone from lacrosse I can't remember that made the majors?
I'm trying to
I
think.
think
2018, yeah, Corey Lee. He's in the
yeah,
major
Corey
leagues.
Lee was on that team, right?
Yep, yep,
And he's been up and down. And I always get Shane McGuire and Reese McGuire confused. And I
yep.
know one of them was in the majors and the other one was from lacrosse, and they're not quite there yet.
For sure. They have Reese McGuire, of course, played with Toronto some, and yeah. So we'll definitely have a chance to reminisce about our time in the Northwoods League here
Great.
together, Ari. But let's go to the biggest news of the sports world right now, and that is the NFL playoffs. We're officially a few days away from Championship Sunday. We have the Ravens playing the Chiefs in the AFC, and the Lions playing the Niners for the top dog in the NFC. Before we get to that, of course, I want to talk about some of the biggest storylines from the divisional round. Just to recap, Ari, the Ravens beat the Texans pretty handily, 34-10. Although if you watch the first half, that wasn't the case. It was tied at 10 going into halftime, but the Ravens pulled away. The 49ers beat the Packers 24-21. San Francisco now 5-0 versus Green Bay in the playoffs since the 2010s. A big moment in the game, of course, was the kicker Anders Carlson for Green Bay missed a field goal with the Packers up 7. That could rather up 4 that could have put them up 7 and maybe put them in a different type of situation. CMC ends up scoring the game-winning touchdown for the Niners. And the 49ers, they had their first win entering the fourth quarter, trailing by 5 or more points under Kyle Shanahan. The other two matchups, the Lions beat the Bucks 31-23. That's Detroit's first NFC Championship game appearance since '91. And the Chiefs, for the third straight year, beat the Bills in the playoffs 27-24. It's actually interesting because the Bills have beaten the Chiefs 3 straight years in the regular season, but the Chiefs have beaten Buffalo in the playoffs. 5 lead changes. The Chiefs didn't punt until the fourth quarter, and Tyler Bass ends up missing wide right to essentially end the game with a minute and a half or so left, similar to how Scott Norwood missed for the Bills back in the Super Bowl in the '90s. So I said a lot there, Ari. Of course, recapping the 4 games: Ravens, Chiefs in the AFC, Lions, Niners in the NFC. What were some of your biggest storylines from the divisional round?
Um, it was a lot of fun. Some good games. I missed the 49ers game. Unfortunately, I was busy and couldn't end up watching. I had to catch up the highlights after. But yeah, a lot of exciting games. And I'm just really happy for Detroit fans overall. Not seeing any success and really having a downturn across all sports. I mean, the Pistons on a historic losing streak, and even the Red Wings have not been any good recently, and that's kind of been their only good team for quite a while. Um, and yeah, to see that, and it keeps showing the stand of the season ticket holders who have been there 50, 60 years and never seen anything. And that's really cool. And I think everyone loves Dan Campbell. He seems like a great, uniter of everyone. Just seems like such a genuine person that it would be so easy to want to play for him and root for him.
And a couple of other questions, Ari, about some of the teams that got eliminated, and of course, a couple of other big stories in the NFL. I was curious, talking about Baker Mayfield. Here's a guy who really had a bounce back year this year, led the Bucks to the playoffs. In fact, it was their third straight divisional title, which a lot of people were not expecting the Bucks to win. Even a weak division going into the season, and Tampa actually improved over the last year of Tom Brady last year because you remember they won the playoffs, so they won the division rather barely, and then end up losing to the Cowboys in the first round. But this year they win that first game against the Eagles and unfortunately lose to the Lions in a close one in the second round. So I was going to ask, is Baker your comeback player of the year? I mean, you think about it, a lot of good candidates this year: Joe Flacco, Damar Hamlin, Brees Hall had a good season, bouncing back for the Jets. But where's your kind of stance on where Baker lines up in that discussion, and is he your pick for comeback player of the year?
That's interesting. That's not something I had really thought of a lot. I think that award has to be for Damar Hamlin, coming back in and getting to play this season, and if not, you have to think Joe Flacco is a bit ahead, just coming out of nowhere and leading a team to the playoffs. Um, but yeah, it's very impressive what Baker's done this year, taking over that team. that was expected, I think, to struggle a good bit this year. Had some issues last year, even with Tom Brady. And, even in this game, played really well, 349 yards, 3 touchdowns in the air. I think Baker is someone who needs a legitimate chip on his shoulder. And it isn't someone like, other athletes that can manufacture that. But when he's the number one overall draft pick, I don't know if this is real or not, but it definitely seems like once he has people who believe in him and say, "Oh, Baker looks really good," maybe doesn't motivate him the same way, and then all of a sudden he gets cut and traded and cut again and signs a prove it deal, and that's what he needs to really propel his play and get his team back in the playoffs. And hats off to him, really impressive.
Yeah, I would say I lean Baker even over some of those other guys. I think Damar Hamlin. I mean, look, if first of all, if any of these guys win, it's a good pick. But Damar Hamlin, look, based on what he went through, I mean, for him to even play a couple snaps this season is just incredible. But I just think I want to give it to the guys that maybe had an injury or didn't have a good season and were able to bounce back. Played essentially the full season. Joe Flacco, you can make a good point. I mean, 6 games into the season. He ends up coming off his couch really to lead the Browns to the playoffs. But I'm going to give it to Baker in my opinion, just because he played the whole season. There was all this kind of criticism after he left Cleveland that he makes more commercials than he does on plays on the field. But I think that he should be in there for the comeback player of the year, and he is my pick. But I do think this year, unlike previous years, maybe that there are a couple of really good candidates that you can pick from that. So it'll be interesting to see who wins that award. I was going to also ask you. I think probably the biggest disappointment of the weekend is the Bills, because here you were, playing the Chiefs again in the playoffs. Your first opportunity to play them at home in Buffalo. But unfortunately, you end up losing that game at home. Josh Allen, I mean, he was spectacular. Had over 350 passing yards. Had a bomb to Stephon Diggs that if Diggs doesn't drop, who knows how that game ends up finishing up. But unfortunately, they do not beat the Chiefs and are sent home again by Patrick Mahomes. I was curious, do you look at the Bills any differently after this game? And do you look at Josh Allen any differently? Because here's a guy who, he's been heralded as one of the top 5 QBs in the league, but unfortunately has been not been able to get past Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs.
Not really. I don't know if that's controversial to say. I don't think this changes my opinion of what the Bills are. I mean, they played a great game. They missed a field goal at the end, and in the windy conditions, Josh Allen played pretty incredible. There was an interesting article, some writing. I can't remember who it was. I think it was at The Ringer that basically um, said that Josh Allen is incredible and one of the best quarterbacks we've ever seen, and just happens to be in the same conference with the greatest quarterback that I've ever seen. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Um, and I mean, you could build a team very easily around either of them. I think the Bills overall do have some improvements to make. I mean, outside of Diggs did not play well at all. I think that's pretty clear, and hasn't played well for a good chunk of the season. I had him in a fantasy league and really fell off at the end. Um, and outside of that, I mean, they really haven't had. Shakir has developed into a weapon. The tight ends are pretty decent, but outside of that, I mean, they just don't have another go-to receiver. And if Diggs isn't playing well, the team is going to struggle. And I think that's probably the priority for them to address. But I mean, just happened to sort of be on the wrong end. It seems like of luck every year against Patrick Mahomes and a crazy Patrick Mahomes experience. And I think there's much you can do about that in the end. And just hope that one of these years it's going to bounce your way.
Yeah, and I hope this isn't the case because I'm a Ravens fan and Lamar's my favorite athlete I think in all of sports, but it kind of seems like it's kind of the Mahomes is MJ and everybody else is kind of the great player that wasn't able to win a ring because of
Yeah.
MJ. I mean, think about it, all the players that MJ stopped from winning a ring, Patrick Ewing, Charles Barkley, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Clyde Drexler, though he did end up winning when Jordan retired. But all these great players that were in the league at the same time as MJ weren't able to win a ring because of his greatness. You kind of feel like maybe are we kind of in that similar situation with Mahomes and all these great QBs, especially in the AFC. But we'll see what happens with that. I was curious. I know it might be a hard question off the top of your head, but if you have to name your top 5 QBs in the game right now, it doesn't have to be in order necessarily, but is Allen in that group? I mean, who are your top 5 QBs if you have to name them off the top of your head right now?
I think Josh Allen is there. Yeah, I think it would be obviously Mahomes, Lamar, Josh Allen, and then it's a little dicey, depending on. I think where you put, where Joe Burrow is probably in that group, assuming he comes back healthy, and then uh, eh, I think it's probably Jalen Hurts is next. I think Herbert slipped a little bit, although, and that's something else we'll talk about and how he might progress. I would probably put Hurts in that group. What do you think?
Yeah, I would probably agree with you. I mean, I think honestly, I mean, Mahomes is clearly the best quarterback in football. I think Lamar Jackson has made. I've always believed this, and I think he's made. I think a lot of the critics silenced with. I really think when he's on his A game, I mean, he almost never loses. I think he's arguably the second best quarterback in the entire league, so he's got to be in there. I think Josh Allen, with his talent, you still got to put him in that top five. Joe Burrow, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt when he's healthy. He's as good as there is. I mean, he's really been Mahomes' one of Mahomes' main foils so far in his career. And I'd probably go with Hurts just because I kind of feel like you have to put a quarterback from the NFC in there. Although the way the Eagles finished the season at 1-6,
Yeah,
certainly I think hurt his stock a little bit. But I think Hurts, Herbert, Lawrence, they're all kind of in that that next tier of guys. So I think for the most part we agree there. But let's talk about
and
Justin
honestly,
Herbert.
I think C.J. Stroud. I
Yeah.
haven't had a chance to watch a ton of him this year, but I think he's kind of right outside that group, and I wouldn't be surprised if fairly soon into next year he's really one of the elite quarterbacks.
And I'm curious to see. We'll talk about it here in a little bit, but what you think about your guy Tua, especially with being a Dolphins fan, how they played this year. But before we get to Tua, I did want to talk about Justin Herbert. You just mentioned him, and probably the biggest news that broke just before we started recording is that Jim Harbaugh finally makes his return to the NFL after almost 10 years at Michigan. He ends up taking them finally to a national championship a couple months, rather a month ago, and he is now the head coach of the LA Chargers. He'll be paired with Justin Herbert. We all know, of course, Jim Harbaugh, one of the best coaches in really all of football. When you think about any level, all the success he had at San Diego, at Stanford, at San Francisco 49ers, taking him nearly beating his brother, John Harbaugh, in the Super Bowl 10 years ago. So we know he's a successful coach. We know the Chargers have been kind of a cursed franchise in a lot of ways. Justin Herbert really hasn't been able to stay healthy. And when he's been healthy, they've seemed to choke away a lot of games. We all remember that 27-0 collapse against the Jaguars last year. So Jim Harbaugh, Ari, was probably the number one candidate this offseason. So
Well,
yeah, yeah. I mean, depending. I mean, I know Bill Belichick's got the resume, but of course, I think people are thinking about long term. I mean, Jim Harbaugh is kind of a guy you can build around. But what do you think, Jim Harbaugh to the Chargers? What do you think about their expectations? And do you think that him and Herbert can at least get the Chargers back into some sort of playoff run here?
yeah, I think they definitely can, but yeah, I'm not sure if you would ask everyone that they would put Harbaugh as number one. Obviously, you have Belichick, Vrabel is an option, um, and some of the coordinators I think would probably be consensus a little bit lower, but yeah, definitely well, maybe the strongest free agent class of head coaches that we've ever seen, on could even be imagined. It's funny you bring up that Super Bowl. I it was on the other day on the NFL Network or a couple of weeks ago, and I was watching it and reminiscing a bit. And it was an incredible game. I was enthralled the whole time. But yeah, I think it's a dangerous combination for sure. I mean, with some of the pieces on that roster, Herbert, you definitely see the potential, the consistency, kind of the knock on him. But on a good day, he's pretty easily a top five quarterback in the NFL. And it's kind of almost easy to forget the sort of immediate success that Jim Harbaugh had in the NFL, and eventually brought that success to Michigan. Obviously, it's so different, what works in college and what works in the NFL. But at the very least, I don't know really what to expect. And right off the bat is going to be interesting. Um, but it's definitely something to another dangerous team, and it just feels like there's so many of those in the AFC and so many quarterback coach combinations that it's going to be such a gauntlet every single year for the next decade. And that's sort of, I think, the biggest takeaway for me is that, as a Dolphins fan, why did he have to come to the AFC?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you too. How much do you think the whole scandal at Michigan, the sign stealing, whatever you want to call it, how much do you think that played a factor? I mean, I know in some ways he was exonerated by the NCAA. He was allowed to coach, but other people will say, well, he just didn't want this investigation hanging over him, and he did. At the end of the day, he did accomplish his goal of taking his alma mater, Michigan, to the promised land, winning a national championship. How much do you think that whole investigation played in his desire to go to the NFL?
That's a good question. I can't really speak for him on that. Probably something, but it also felt like every year for the last 5 years, his name would come up as a possibility, and that definitely wasn't coming out of nowhere. There was definitely some inkling that he wanted to be back in the NFL sooner or later. Probably winning a national championship kind of was the final straw on that, and said, okay, now I can try to do the Pete Carroll and win both. And yeah, and the right opportunity came up, and not often that you get this kind of a roster and a quarterback, and some of the pieces on defense with Derwin James, Joey Bosa, that can pretty quickly become a dangerous team.
I was going to ask you. I mean, we've talked about how stacked the AFC is with all these young quarterbacks. Of course, Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, Joe Burrow, Trevor Lawrence,
Yeah.
C.J. Stroud. Now, if you had to predict, I know it's hard to project. Any number of things can happen, an injury or two in a particular season. Do you think in the next 5 years the Chargers win the Super Bowl? If you had to predict right now,
Just given that question, I would say no. If you were to force me to say yes or no, but I definitely wouldn't rule out the possibility. I mean, it seems like the biggest thing is whatever curse is upon the Chargers that causes everyone to get injured every year and causes them to, no matter what their roster and regular season, get bounced early in the playoffs. Uh, but we'll see. I mean, we see the Lions now in the NFC Championship game, so really anything is possible.
yeah, I agree with you. If you made me say yes or no, I'd say no just because of the wealth of quarterbacks. But again, you never know. I mean, an injury here or two there, and all of a sudden we're talking about a team that could be elevated at the expense of another team. For example, I mean, Joe Burrow getting injured obviously took the Bengals out of contention. So you never know. I mean, one of those injuries here, one or two every year, that could end up being the decisive factor. So we'll see what happens with Jim Harbaugh. And I want to talk about the other big quarterback, rather big coaching potential hire is that Bill Belichick, of course, in a lot of people's eyes, the greatest NFL coach of all time, 6 Super Bowl championships with the Patriots, ends up parting ways with New England after this season. Again, and curious to hear what you think about this as well. People I think are gonna give Belichick some flack. And I'm not saying he made all the correct decisions, Ari, but they're going to say, "Well, you didn't win without Tom Brady," and I would say I think that's a little bit skewed because
It's
you
very that's very oversimplified, I would say. But yeah, finish
yeah,
your.
well, I'm just gonna say, you look at it. I mean, look, this year was bad, no question about it. But if you look at every other year since Tom Brady, the Patriots were either in the playoffs or they just barely missed by one or two games here or there. So I think that look, the guy didn't forget how to coach. He's still a six-time Super Bowl champion. Um, personnel decisions, maybe he didn't make the best decisions. But what were your thoughts on that? I thought Bill was getting a little bit too much of hate for how the Patriots performed this season.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's clearly one of the best, if not the best NFL coach of all time. I mean, he went 11-5 with Matt Castle and that roster. I don't think you can ever forget. I think I think he was still doing a good job, especially the defense was strong, the schemes were there, keeping up with the times. And the issue I was pretty clearly the personnel decisions and something that he was probably good at for a while and has struggled with in recent years. And over the last 3 years, I mean, still many things have just kind of been baffling. And you look at the roster right now, and it's so depleted. And I think Robert Kraft and that administration kind of feels like you couldn't. There wasn't a way to take out that duty without and keeping him as a coach. And I think if you wanted to do that, maybe that was a possibility. But I couldn't see Bill Belichick ever agreeing to something like that. But yeah, I think he's clearly an attractive head coach candidate, even if he's not going to be there for. He's probably going to be however long it takes to break Don Shula's record and then say, okay, I've had enough.
And I wanted to ask you
So,
about that because you look at it, the Falcons have been. I think he's interviewed with them twice. They've kind of been now, especially now that the Chargers are off the market. The Falcons have been the team most linked to Belichick. And I saw something that Kirk Cousins was saying that if there was an opportunity to play for Bill Belichick somewhere, he wouldn't necessarily rule it out. And there's been other reports where Josh McDaniels, who whatever you want to say about him as a head coach, I mean he's a pretty good offensive coordinator, would join Bill Belichick wherever they would go. So Ari, what do you think about a potential Bill Belichick, Josh McDaniels head coach, offensive coordinator pairing, coupled with Kirk Cousins coming to Atlanta? and potentially making a run at it there. I mean, I think it's pretty safe to say the Falcons have a lot of talent. Arthur Smith, I think was heavily criticized by a lot of Falcon fans for the way he utilized that offense. But you bring Bill in there, you bring Josh McDaniels in there, you bring Bill, a competent quarterback, and Kirk Cousins. I mean, do you think with that trio, the Falcons could contend? I'm going to say yes, just because you think about it, all the great coaches are in the NFC. You think about, I mean, look at the Final Four in the NFC this year. You had Jordan Love, Jared Goff, and Brock Purdy among the four. So I think, look, I mean, you bring Kirk Cousins to the Falcons, you bring the greatest coach of all time, Bill Belichick. I think the Falcons can make some noise. What do you think about that?
Um, so is it just me, or is it impossible to picture Bill Belichick in Falcons colors? Like I just cannot get that image into my brain. And it seems like that's what's likely to happen, though. I could definitely see Kirk Cousins working out well. He I think has a lot of traits of a somewhat poor man's Tom Brady, but has a lot of abilities, especially in a strong offense, to really capitalize on the talent around him. In a way that Tom Brady often did with some really good teams. Um, I don't know if I really like bringing in Josh McDaniels. I kind of think that the best move, and I don't know if this is something Bill Belichick wants to do, but bring in someone younger, someone new who kind of knows, has some new ideas for different schemes, and instead of running the same thing over and over again, and teams kind of have an idea of what you're doing. And clearly, there's some issues with McDaniel's and how he's managed people over the years, and his relationships with players. I would prefer to see someone new if for the Falcons to have success. Um, and I think that Bill Belichick and that roster would have a lot of success, either with Kirk Cousins or going up in the draft and finding whoever the right fit is.
Well, we both agree there. Well, let's get right to it, Ari. The NFC and AFC championship games, previewing them and making our picks. We'll first start with the NFC championship game, the Lions at 49ers. That'll actually be the late game on Sunday night. The Niners currently are favored by 7. It's the first NFC championship game, as we were talking about earlier, for the Detroit Lions since 1991. The third straight season and the fourth time in the last 5 years, conversely, for the 49ers that they've been in the NFC championship game. Jared Goff, on one hand, is trying to make his second Super Bowl. We all remember he made it in 2018 with the LA Rams. And Brock Purdy's trying to prove himself because here was a team with Jimmy G for years who made a Super Bowl and a couple NFC championship games, was never able to get to the promised land. Purdy coming in as Mr. Irrelevant, the last pick in the NFL draft at one point, trying to prove that he can be the guy to lead this team with so many stellar weapons into to a Super Bowl Lombardi trophy. Although right now, big news is that Deebo Samuel's 50-50 to play. That's a big offensive weapon for Purdy and the Niners, but they still got CMC. They've still got uh, George Kittle leading the way, Brandon Ayuk. So you know that this offense is as talented as it gets, even without Deebo Samuel. So you look at it, Ari. I mean, I feel like it's obvious to say all the pressures on the Niners. The Lions, they've already won 2 playoff games. They're playing with house money. Purdy's got a lot to prove. Goff is playing with not as much pressure, and he's another guy. I mean, you talk about comeback seasons. He's really reestablished himself under Dan Campbell and Ben Johnson in that offense. So, what do you think, Lions, Niners? What are some of your big storylines?
Um, so one thing is, I think I agree with you that the pressure's on for San Francisco. But I think that the Lions still have something to prove, and I'm kind of surprised about the 7 point line because I could see it being closer. I mean, the way that both teams played last week, San Francisco really struggled, showed some weaknesses. Detroit has looked strong through the playoffs. I think it's going to be a good game. I think it's going to come down to probably some plays late in the game and who has the edge there. And we'll see. I do worry about how the Lions can respond to the coaching scheme for on defense against Shanahan's offense. That's going to be they have some talent on defense, but it's going to be a big struggle to scheme up against that.
I'm curious too, Ari. I mean, we talk about it. Look, the Lions, I think we can all agree they've already won 2 playoff games. They're playing with house money. They don't have as much pressure as maybe some of these other teams in the Final Four. But I was thinking about it. First of all, there's no guarantee you're going to be in the spot every year. I mean, you got to have breaks go your way. Maybe another team that you have a difficult matchup with gets upset like the Cowboys did this year. But I was thinking about it too. I mean, you look at the NFC North. You got Jordan Love and the Packers. I mean, first of all, I'm jealous of the Packers. It seems like they're just able to transition from good quarterback to good quarterback with Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers, and now Jordan Love. He's not going anywhere for the next decade. You've got the Vikings, who I think in a lot of ways, I think the Vikings probably win that division if Kirk Cousins is healthy. I mean, he goes down, Justin Jefferson goes down. That was a big loss for Minnesota. So if they bring him back, they've got to be in there in terms of a team to watch out for. And then the Bears, you don't know what they're going to do. Maybe they draft Caleb Williams. Maybe they stick with Justin Fields and retool that Bears team. And then the Bears still won 7 games with how bad they were at points in the season. So I just think, look, no one's expecting the Lions to win. No one's going to say, oh, it was a failed season if the Lions don't end up winning the Super Bowl. But part of me is like, you don't know when you're going to get to this opportunity again. And especially against the Niners team, Brock Purdy did not look the greatest at times in that game against Green Bay on Saturday. It might be like, hey, this might be your only opportunity. Who knows for the next decade or so? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean it's always hard, and even in the NFC, you mentioned all those quarterbacks in the NFC North and all the potential. Um, I totally am right with you on the Packers. I mean, seeing there's some NFL teams that have just never had a stretch of being bad, and they get to watch their team in the playoffs every year. Meanwhile, I'm watching the Dolphins just flounder around. My entire life, I haven't ever seen them win a playoff games. I think they were three. I think I was 3 years old the last time that happened. Um, but yeah, you never know what's going to happen. I do think they have that feeling, and I think that's a bonus of not having the pressure on you. Campbell can go for it on fourth down all the time and get some extra yards and some points, put pressure on the defense, and Shanahan's going to have to really find something in the offense to exploit some of the holes in the Lions defense. And I think Brock Purdy's going to have to play. I mean, hopefully the weather seems like it's going to be better than it was last weekend. Brock Purdy's going to have to play a better game than last week. But he has shown this year that he can really step into a moment and execute that offense at an extremely high level, and that's been impressive to watch.
When we talk about all the weapons the Niners have offensively, let's not forget about the Lions. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's one of the best young receivers in the game. Sam Laporta, what a rookie season he's had. He was on fire against the Tampa Bucks. I mean, he was kind of the main target it seemed like for Jared Goff. So you look at these two teams, Ari. Who do you think ultimately wins? And do you think the line ends up covering? Whether it's in terms of -7 for San Francisco, who's your pick in this game?
I'm gonna pick San Francisco. I think it seems like the safer pick. I'll regret myself if the Lions win and I didn't pick that, but um, I think San Francisco wins. I don't think they're gonna win by 7. I think it's gonna be a close game that comes down to some plays at the end. What do you have?
I'm going with the San Francisco 49ers too, Ari. I saw the stat earlier that I think was one of the main factors in me making that pick is the Lions have only played 1 game outdoors since their week 9 bye. So this game coming up on Sunday will be just their second game in that span. So, we all know that Goff has played considerably worse in outdoors. And I just think also, I mean, look, you got to give I don't want to take away from the Lions. At the end of the day, you got to play who you got to play. But I do think that their path to the NFC Championship game has been a little bit more luckier than you would have think. I mean, look, you give them credit for beating the Rams, Matt Stafford coming back to Detroit, their Super Bowl championship team from a few years ago. It was going to be a tough matchup, but then you follow that up with Baker and the Bucks. Maybe not the strongest potential matchup you could have had, especially with the Cowboys getting upset and the Eagles also being the defending NFC champions. So I think that Brock Purdy was able to make a couple of big throws in that Packers game, a game that Green Bay probably should have won. But they end up hanging on and surviving and advancing. So I think the Niners just have a little bit more what it takes. But I do agree with you. I don't think the Niners cover. I'm going to say they probably win by 3 or 4 points. So there you go.
I
I'm
also
also going
think
with the Niners. Yep.
if San Francisco is going to win in a blowout, it's going to be that defense. And like you mentioned, Jared Goff having to go against them, and it's going to be really tough against that defensive line, those linebackers, and trying to find open guys. And he has those weapons, but if the offensive line can't hold up as well as it has in a lot of recent games, I could see it getting away from them a bit.
All right, so there you go. Both me and Ari agree that the San Francisco 49ers will defeat the Detroit Lions to make it to the Super Bowl. We now next move Ari to the game that I think is the premier matchup of the weekend. The Chiefs at the Ravens. The Ravens currently favored by -3.5. I am a Ravens fan, which we will get to talking about that in a little bit here. I do have a question for you about that, but this is the first AFC Championship game in Baltimore. They've obviously won the Super Bowl a couple times, but both times that was on the road. that they made it to the AFC Championship game. This is also the first AFC title game not hosted by Kansas City, in Kansas City rather, since 2017. This is the last, and actually talking about that, I don't know if you knew this or not, Ari, but the last AFC title game that did not feature Mahomes or Brady was 2011. Do you remember who the two quarterbacks were for that game?
Oh man. So that wasn't the Flacco year. That was before that. So that would have been, was that a Roethlisberger game?
Yep.
Pittsburgh, and then who would they have played? Was that the year that Brady was hurt, or was it? No, it was probably. Was it a Manning one?
No, it
Probably,
was
right?
no, actually, it was, believe it or not, the New York Jets. Mark Sanchez. Remember they made
Oh,
two
that's
straight.
right. That
Yep.
was. I thought that was earlier.
Yeah, so
Okay.
2011 was the last time, yep, that we didn't have Mahomes or Brady in the AFC Championship game. It was Mark Sanchez versus Ben Roethlisberger, Jets Steelers that year. Patrick Mahomes, by the way, is 3-1 against Lamar. But Lamar did win their last matchup. They played a couple years ago. This is a matchup of really the two guys who have locked up the MVPs the last couple of years. Lamar won in 2018. He's the likely 2023 MVP. Patrick Mahomes won in 2019 and also won in 2022. So obviously, this is a matchup of the Titans. It seems like, Ari, you've got the defending champions, you've got the team and the Ravens who have been the best team all season long. You've got Travis Kelsey, you've got Taylor Swift, that whole mania. You've got the defense of Baltimore. John Harbaugh is a great coach, and he was also a longtime assistant under Andy Reid, special teams coach. So many great storylines in this game. It's the game of the weekend. What stands out rather to you?
What stands out is the difference in the quarterback play between the NFC Championship game and the AFC game. Not to take away from what Brock Purdy and Jared Goff have done this year. They've been fantastic and really played at a high level, but their top end is, I think, nowhere near, and I think that's pretty easy to see. It's nowhere near what Mahomes and Lamar Jackson do on a regular basis. Um, I just have a hard time seeing anyone beating Baltimore at this point. The way that they've played, they've the games that Lamar Jackson has played in, not the Steelers game at the end of the regular season, but they've won 7 games in a row, and they beat the Rams in overtime, and then after that, 23-7 over Jacksonville, 33-19 over San Francisco, 56-19 over Miami, 34-10 over Houston. Even before that, I mean, a 37-3 win over Seattle, 38-6 over Detroit earlier in the year. I mean, they're playing good teams and just steamrolling everyone they play. And it's hard to see that stopping anytime soon with the way that Lamar looks and that offense is rolling.
And I wanted to get your take on this, sorry, because I know you kind of alluded to it earlier, but where does Patrick Mahomes rank in terms of your top QBs of all time? I mean, some people are saying he's already passed Tom Brady. I mean, a lot of people I think agree he's definitely, if not the most talented, one of the top two most talented quarterbacks they've seen with Aaron Rodgers, so certainly in that conversation. So, do you think Patrick Mahomes has already surpassed Tom Brady as the GOAT?
I think it depends on what you mean. I mean, in terms of greatness and legacy and accomplishments, Tom Brady is the clear winner. If you're looking at top end talent and you know plays that make you gasp and things like that, it's Mahomes and it's Rodgers and not particularly close. I mean, after that it's Josh Allen. And you and I are a little younger and you haven't seen quarterbacks from years past, but I always look at Dan Marino highlights as someone who was incredible. I just think it depends on what you're trying to measure, but Mahomes is definitely on a path. I mean, 6 straight AFC Championship games to open his career. 3 of them he won. Won 2 Super Bowls. The two that he lost, I think, both came down to the final plays. I don't have that right in front of me, but um, he's on that path and what he's done with Andy Reid. But I just think that the raw end talent is unlike anything else that we've ever seen.
Do you think that Mahomes can surpass Brady's 7 rings? I mean, for me, Ari, I think that in order to surpass Brady, I mean, I think Mahomes almost has to win 8. When you think about it, Brady won 7. The seventh one, he beat Mahomes. And you think about it too, I don't know if we'll ever see this again, but Tom Brady went to 3 Super Bowls and won 2 of them after he turned 40. I mean, I think it's just incredible what he was able to do over his career. So, do you think that Mahomes can at least match 7 at some point? I mean, he's clearly on the path, but you never know in a given year with an injury, a down year. Although the Chiefs, even with a down year, all their receivers dropping passes left and right, they're still in the AFC Championship game. What do you think? Do you think Mahomes eventually could touch Brady's 7, or do you think it's probably out of the question?
I don't think that's possible, and I'm not really a count the rings kind of person. I mean, you can't discount. everything else that was happening in New England during those times. And you obviously can't discount what Patrick Mahomes has had throughout the years with Tyreek Hill and Andy Reid and Travis Kelsey and so many weapons with that. I think this, we talked about how many young, incredible quarterbacks there are right now in the AFC. I think it's going to be hard to get to the Super Bowl every year, and winning is such a challenge. And that's, I think, what makes what Brady and Belichick did just so mind-boggling. And I think looking back, we'll all be saying, how in the world did that happen? That they played for so long and had so much success every year.
So who do you got, Ari? I mean, Chiefs at Ravens. It's like I said, the premier matchup of the weekend. Do you think Lamar leads the Ravens to the Super Bowl, or do you think Mahomes shows he's still the top dog in the league?
I am picking Baltimore to win this game. Not easily, but by a fairly healthy margin. I just think that they've been going through everyone and are just at such a high level. And obviously, Mahomes can do Mahomes things, but without the weapons on offense, I don't think they'll be able to keep up with the Ravens on offense. And unless they get something superhuman out of their defense and find ways to slow that down, I just don't see it.
I agree with you. I am going with the Ravens to win the AFC Championship game and advance to the Super Bowl. I just think I have to believe that Baltimore defense, which was what top 3 in the league, is better than the Bills defense and would be able to force the Chiefs to punt before the fourth quarter. So I think that that led by Patrick Queen, Roquan Smith, Lamar Jackson, I think will make a lot of plays with his legs. He's hard to guard, and he's got the receivers now that he didn't have in previous years. Zay Flowers, Odell Beckham Jr., Mark Andrews may come back this weekend when he's healthy. He's I think in that top 3 conversation with Kelsey, of course, being one. So I think I think the Ravens do get it done, and I do expect them to. I mean, it's still close because I think that you got to give Mahomes credit because he's that guy. But I think the Ravens do end up getting it done. So I actually predicted this before the playoffs started. I don't think it's a hot take because they were both the 1 seeds, but I had the Ravens over the 49ers to win it all. I'm still sticking with that. What about you? In a Ravens 49ers Super Bowl matchup, would be a rematch of that Christmas night matchup you mentioned a few minutes ago. Who ends up winning that game?
I would pick the Ravens to win. We also see another thing. Lamar had one of his biggest rushing performances of the year last week. It seems like, and it makes sense that they would use his legs a little bit more. And when it's the playoffs, and you don't want him to get hurt, but you can kind of leave it a little more out there. And I think the dimensions that he brings are just impossible to stop right now.
For sure. So we both agree. I mean, a lot of a lot of agreeing on
Yeah.
this podcast. We both picked the 49ers over the Lions and the Ravens over the Chiefs, and we both agree that the Ravens will defeat the Niners in the Super Bowl. I wanted to ask you, Ari. I always like to ask this question whenever I do this podcast. Uh, the one leading into Championship Sunday is, what Super Bowl would you want the most? I mean, I know you said the Ravens and Niners, but is there another matchup you would prefer more, whether it's Ravens Lions or Chiefs and 49ers or Chiefs and Lions, which would be a rematch, by the way, of Chiefs and Niners would be a rematch of the Super Bowl from a few years ago where Mahomes won his first ring. And then Chiefs and Lions would be a rematch of week 1 when the Lions kind of started this whole impressive season they've been on, winning in Kansas City on opening night. So I know you said Ravens over 49ers, but is there one of those other matchups that you prefer, or is this the one that you predicted, the one you would prefer the most?
Oh, I would love to see the Lions get a win in this and have a chance to play for the Super Bowl. That fan base has really had such a hard time. We've talked about the teams that have had the success every year. Packers, the Lions are the complete opposite of that, and to to see them, they're just so much fun to watch. And, Jared Goff getting a chance to redeem himself would be really cool to see. And honestly, I'm happy with either AFC teams. I love watching high level quarterback play. I love watching Mahomes. I love watching Lamar. Um, both of them, I think, deserve to be in a Super Bowl.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, obviously, being a Ravens fan, I want the Ravens to be in the AFC side of the bracket. But I do think whoever wins the Super Bowl, rather whoever wins the AFC Championship game, will be probably the Super Bowl champion. That's my prediction. But yeah, I would say Ravens Lions. I'd love to see that. I mean, a cursed franchise like Detroit, and then a player as fantastic as Lamar is in the Super Bowl, I think would be must-watch TV. But either way, Ravens winning, I think that's my most preferable matchup. But I wanted to also ask you too, Ari, about in terms of, I've been doing this every round in terms of ranking the players with the most pressure to win, and of course we're now down to 4 teams, and so I've really only considered 3 players in terms of ranking them in terms of the most pressure to win. I'm going to say Lamar Jackson. I mean, look, the Ravens have been the best team all year long. You look at their 4 losses. I'm not going to count the last one of the Steelers in the regular season because they didn't play their starters, the Ravens. But all 3 of those losses were either on the last possession or by 7 points or a one possession game. So very easily the Ravens could have gone undefeated this year. The Ravens have just, I mean, they've blown out, like you talked about, good teams, the Lions, the Dolphins, the Seahawks. I think beat the Bengals twice when Joe Burrow was healthy, by the way. So I think that with all that and all that in the rear view, there's no question Lamar Jackson has the most pressure to win the Super Bowl. Number 2, I'm going to go with Brock Purdy, but I'm also going to couple that with the 49ers as a whole. I mean, this is a franchise that has been to the Super Bowl, to NFC Championship game a couple times, and has not been able to win the Lombardi Trophy. I just think that, when you talk about Kyle Shanahan, all those 49er players, Brock Purdy, I mean, here's a guy that if you don't win it, people are going to say, hey, look, I mean, we at least got to a Super Bowl. We were about to win a Super Bowl with Jimmy G. You haven't been able to bring us that promise. And I think Brock Purdy is under a lot of pressure. And then I'm going to, like I mentioned Mahomes, not in terms of if he wins this year, it'll be as much of a failure as, say, Lamar or Purdy, but in terms of, again, the overall legacy conversation, where does he rank in the GOAT conversation? I think he's got to start racking these Super Bowls to, again, compete with Brady and maybe some of these other guys. But I'm going Lamar, Purdy, Mahomes. What do you think about that list?
I I agree with some of it. I think Lamar is definitely up there with the way that they've struggled in the playoffs. Um, one thing I didn't mention is the possibility I thought might happen is that after 2 weeks off, they'd be a little rusty uh, and you think about the old Peyton Manning Colts teams and how every year they would go, be 14-0 and rest everyone for 3 weeks and then not have the right momentum in the playoffs. I think getting over that hump is a big step and getting a big playoff win. And now they are rolling at this point. But I think definitely the pressure's on. I mean, you already see some of the unhinged things people say about him and his style of play, even when they're winning. Um, and I think more than Brock Purdy, it's on Kyle Shanahan. I mean, obviously the Falcons Super Bowl, it hasn't ever won one. It seems like it's right there every year. But yeah, I think the questions do start to come after a certain point of can he lead his team all the way, and now that he has his quarterback, um, it's definitely something I'm looking at. And I don't know if I agree with Mahomes having pressure on him. Maybe it's can he do it without Tyreek Hill, although he did prove that last year. So I think he's already proven quite a bit. And if Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Kadarius Toney can't lead him to a Super Bowl this year, I think that's not necessarily something on him.
I was curious
And
though.
maybe Taylor Swift is number three.
Oh, yeah. I was gonna ask you about that. I mean, what do you think? I mean, to me, it's gotten annoying. I mean, look, respect to them. Him and her and Travis Kelsey have a relationship, but I just think the constant, and again, I understand it from a TV perspective, cutting to her during games, but I just think it's gotten annoying and to where I think a lot of America, if not most of America, except Kansas City, is rooting for Lamar Jackson to prevent a Taylor Swift Super Bowl. What do you think about that?
I kind of don't really care much either way, honestly. I mean, it's 5 seconds on my TV screen of what pretty clearly the most famous person in the U.S. right now, and I think you can't blame anyone for going that. My girlfriend is sort of a medium level Swiftie, but already a bit of a football fan going in, so not quite on that side of things. But I think it's enjoyable to have that kind of relationship. I mean, Taylor Swift's famous for dating other kinds of musicians and actors and a certain type, and Travis Kelsey breaks that mold in a way that I think is very fun. And I definitely would appreciate more shots of Jason Kelsey in the booth also. So yeah, I think that's a win-win for everyone on that.
I was gonna ask you too about the Niners. I feel like the story already got buried a little bit with all the other, obviously the on the play, the games taking precedent. But there was a report that apparently Purdy had revealed this in an article written somewhere that Kyle Shanahan had tried to get Tom Brady to come out of retirement and play for his hometown San Francisco team for one more year to potentially make another run at the Super
Oh
Bowl.
wow.
What are your thoughts on that? Do you think the Niners would have been as successful? I'm going to say no, actually, because I just think we saw Brady last year. Don't get me wrong; he was still good enough to lead the Bucks to the playoffs, but you could just tell at 46 his arm strength wasn't there. He had it's slowing down. I mean, look, he's 46 and playing a pretty violent sport. So I don't know that, and I don't think that Tom Brady would have been better than Brock Purdy this year. I think the Niners were lucky that Brady stayed retired and they stuck with Purdy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I hadn't seen that report actually. I never know how much stock to put into that kind of thing because it feels like you get that report on every team, and maybe it is true, and maybe they're all are trying to get Tom Brady. But I agree that I think Tom Brady would have a good amount of success even at 46, the way he played last year with that offensive line. That's always been his strength, is with a good offensive line and with good receivers. He can maximize. He can do the most with most than anyone else ever, pretty much. Um, but yeah, I think right now, and that's also a strength of Brock Purdy. I think is that he can do a lot with when the plays are there and when he has those weapons and in a good system. But yeah, I think I would take Brock Purdy right now. But I still think that they would be in a pretty good spot with Tom Brady. But I'm happy as someone who was very tired of Tom Brady and who had been going against him for 20 years to have give someone else a chance.
I wanted to talk about that. You talk about your favorite teams, and correct me if I'm wrong. So you're a Miami sports fan, of course. You root for Northwestern, being that's your alma mater. So the Heat, the Dolphins, the Marlins. Those are your teams right there. Hurricane.
Yeah, I kind of gave up on the Marlins after too many times of trading away my favorite player and just not having any connections to anyone left. I started rooting for the Padres. I'll see how committed I actually am to that. Um, but yeah, the Dolphins have been my team pretty much my whole life, and been a lot of losses at the hands of Tom Brady, although not as many as you would think. But just in terms of general division standings, yeah, that's been the story of the last 20 years.
And what do you think, Ari, about how the Dolphins played this year? I mean, I thought it was remarkable that you had all these quarterback injuries, but the two guys who had been injured the most in previous years, Lamar Jackson and Tua Tagovailoa, end up staying healthy. And of course, I think Tyreek Hill had a legitimate case to be the MVP before he, missed a game or two, which I think will end up docking him. But you saw how anemic that Dolphins offense looked without him. I thought he showed it time and time again why he, in my opinion, is the best receiver in football. Pair him with Jalen Waddle. That's I think the best receiving duo in the league. And then of course you got Mike McDaniel, who's a nice young coach who was very colorful on the sideline as well. So he was very quotable for the media. But what are your thoughts on the Dolphins season? It was pretty successful, and do you think they can contend for a Super Bowl? Because again, like we talked about, it Tua is right in the mix with all these other young quarterbacks.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many questions with the way that that season ended. I think in hindsight, it'll be pretty easy to say, okay, this was an extremely successful season. The problem is it wasn't good enough. I mean, we saw at the end of the year, and they were banged up on defense, but the defense wasn't even the issue. Just the offense had nothing against good defenses really throughout the year, and in the big games at the end of the year in Buffalo and Kansas City, they were just really unable to do anything. And the question is, what do they do going forward? I mean, I like Tua. He's a good guy. I like watching him on Hard Knocks. He has a completely corny personality, which is exactly what you want in a quarterback. Um, and Mike McDaniel and Tua are pretty clearly the best quarterback and coach that the team has had since Dan Marino and Don Shula. The question is, are they good enough? And I mean, we do you give up on Tua? I think what seems most likely is that it'll be maybe a 3 or 4 year extension, a little below the top of the line market, maybe around that 30 to 40 million dollar range per year, with various bonuses and however NFL contracts work, who really knows? But and it's going to be interesting to see now what happens. I don't know if you saw that Vic Fangio is leaving, and seems like he's going to be the new Eagles coordinator, and there was some confusion. We'll see what reporting ends up coming out about what happened at the end of the season and what led to that. Um, and we'll see what the Dolphins look like. I mean, they have so many pieces. The offensive line has pieces, but is still a bit of a mess, and that showed its head at the end of the year. And I mean, the question is the issue with the play calling, and is the play calling, or is the play calling limited because of the quarterback, or is the quarterback limited because of the play calling? I mean, if you look at the statistics on the year, I mean, they were just so reliant on Tyreek Hill and Waddle to some extent. Both of them were limited late in the year, even when they were playing, were pretty clearly banged up, and they just had no other options. Their leading receiver is Durham Smythe, who had 35 catches and 366 yards. And I mean, but the other thing is, I mean, Cedric Wilson and Braxton Berrios should be good enough for that kind of a role. And for whatever reason, the plays weren't drawn up for them. They didn't have that opportunity. So it'll be interesting to see what they do and where they see um, an improvement and where they need to do and what they want to do with the quarterback position. I'll be on board no matter what. I think number one priority right now is the offensive line. I mean, you see what Brock Purdy and Jared Goff, and I would put them at pretty similar levels to Tua, if not Tua above them, and what they could do with that kind of offensive line.
And Ari, this is something that I always say when people ask, "Well, can Tua win the big game?" or "Well, can Dak win the big game?" And my response is, what's your alternative? I mean, unless you're saying, I'm
Right.
going to trade for Justin Herbert, or I'm going to, trade for Caleb Williams or some young phenom who hasn't even proven himself in the NFL. I mean, to me, you've got to be realistic about your options and say, look, I know Tua's, he until this year he had, injury prospects. It seemed like every year trouble staying healthy. But look, he's the best option we have. When he's been good enough, we've been able to win in the regular season and have a chance to get to the tournament. So I think oftentimes we forget about that as fans. We're like, oh, we is he the guy that can get it done? Well, what's your option? What's sometimes your the alternative is not as good as what you have currently.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And for Packers fans will never know this feeling, but when if you have Tua and you know what you have, or even if you don't know what you have, you have something, and it's pretty clearly the best thing that the Dolphins have had in such a long time. And if you say, okay, Tua's not enough, we need to find someone else, and then all of a sudden you're wandering through that wilderness, and I've seen you're trying to go with Chad Henne and uh, yeah, Matt Moore and whoever you can try to find, and then you get a first round pick, and it's not anyone good, and then you're where the Bears are now, and you say, okay, now what do we do? I totally agree that sometimes you're better off sticking with someone that is good, even if and then building around that, than trying to start from scratch, especially with a team that really had such a good season and has so much to build on.
All right, this is the number one question I actually wanted to ask you, but when we were preparing for this podcast, and that is, can you be a fan of two teams in one sport? Let me explain myself here, and I want to be clear that this only applies to the NFL. This is not the case, and so basically, I'm from the DC area, so I root for, basically all the DC sports teams. Rather than that, the Nationals are my number one team of any sport, and of course, I root for the alma mater, Virginia Tech. But I kind of grew up because the Commanders were so, I mean, obviously toxic with the Dan Snyder era. They made the playoffs every once in a while, but Dan Snyder was arguably the worst owner in the league. I became more of a Ravens fan, and especially now that Lamar's been back in, been in the. I mean, Lamar Jackson's my favorite athlete. I mean, no question about it. He's my favorite player to watch, and so, I've kind of been a Ravens fan, but I also consider myself a fair weather Commanders fan in that you know if knock on wood, I mean they're in a worse spot than the Dolphins. If they ever get good, I'm going to be hardcore Commanders, and of course Lamar's going to retire eventually. So I think my Ravens fandom will kind of fade to the mist. So what do you think about that? I mean, do you think you can be a fan of two teams? I mean, this is a debate that I've been having with my friends, and I thought, hey, doing the podcast, it'd be good to ask the guests. So what do you think, especially in one sport? Can you be a fan of two teams, or is it more? Do you think, well, you can be a fan of one team, and maybe if you have a favorite player, you can wish for them to do well. But to me, that's like, well, you're basically saying you're a fan because if you want your favorite player on another team to do well, and you're basically rooting for the team. So, I know that's kind of a jumbled question there, but what do you think? Because even you mentioned it, I mean, a couple minutes ago about the Marlins. I mean, you grew up a Marlins fan, but have kind of faded away from them, and now rooting for the Padres. So, what do you think? Can you be a fan of two teams in one sport?
Yeah, I think you can. I think you can kind of do whatever you want. I kind of like it's sports. It's not that big a deal. Obviously, it so means so much to us, but I don't think anyone's gonna say like, "Oh, you're a bad fan." I mean, I think about in March Madness last year. I grew up in Boca Raton, Florida, and did some dual enrollment classes at FAU, and all of a sudden I turn on March Madness and FAU is playing, and I'm like so much more invested than I ever thought I would have been, even with Northwestern also in the bracket. Um, that was fun. My girlfriend has about 7 or 8 favorite teams on any given day. So yeah, I think you root for whoever you want to root for. Yeah, I think a lot of people find players that they like and root for those, and I think that's also fine. You can root for your fantasy team. I was a big Drew Brees fan for a long time, and so I sort of in that took on sort of rooting for the Saints through big games. And especially if you're if one of your teams is just not interesting the way that Washington is sometimes, and the way that the Dolphins have been in the past. Yeah, I don't see why you can't have different teams and you root for them however you're feeling in different ways.
Well, thank you, Ari. You're a good man for that. I really appreciate you agreeing with me there. But I want to ask you too about in terms of Northwestern. I mean, here's a team that's kind of going. They're not realigning themselves, but the Big Ten, the conference that they're in, is realigning with all the teams from the Pac-12 coming in: UCLA, USC, Washington, Washington State. What's your thoughts on college football realignment? And of course, Northwestern is going to be affected by that because they're going to be making trips out to the West Coast.
I hate it, man. I it's all about, the money that administrators at colleges get out of it, and I don't see any positives for the fans. I mean, you think about, and it's all based on football, and think about an average basketball player now, and in the middle of the season, you have to take a trip from Eugene, Oregon to Piscataway, New Jersey, and all of a sudden you're missing a week of classes. And I just think that all of that is just it's so unnecessary. And the Big Ten tournament, I was thinking about this earlier today. What do you do when you have 18 teams and they had the format for 14 and with the double buys and everything? Now they're talking about, maybe you don't have everyone in the tournament. Um, I yeah, and you there's no rivalries. I mean, how are you going to convince Rutgers and Oregon that they're in a rivalry together, or Minnesota and UCLA? I just don't see. I'm just not a fan of these changes, and I don't know what the solution is, and it seems like that's going to be where we are in the future. But maybe there's a way to spin off football and have the other sports. And I'm a big fan of different college sports: women's basketball, volleyball, baseball, sports like that, and it's just such a negative impact having all of these rivalries broken up or jumbled. What are your thoughts on everything?
No, I agree with you, and you mentioned it. I think that it's gonna shortchange the fans. I mean, I think back in the day, for example, when I've talked to people about this because I'm from the DC area. As I talked about, Maryland was in the ACC, and a lot of their fans could do weekend day trips to other schools in the ACC. They could go to Virginia Tech, UVA, North Carolina, Duke, NC State, Penn State. Well, though Penn State wasn't necessarily in the ACC, but another weekend trip. Whereas now, I mean, especially in the Big Ten, being in Maryland, maybe you can go to Ohio State, maybe you can go to Penn State for a weekend or a day trip,
Sure,
but
yeah.
well, certainly not Ohio State for a day trip. But outside of that, I mean, you've got to fly out and you've got to spend more money. You
Now
can't
you're
really
going to
drive to any of these
Washington.
places. Yeah. Then obviously, yeah, it's not even a factor when you talk about the West Coast team. So I just think that the fans have been shortchanged the most. And again, like you talked about, it seems like it's only football and men's basketball, but I do think as a whole, college football is going to suffer in terms of really creating those regional rivalries that you used to have back in the day.
Yeah, I agree, and I yeah, it's unfortunate to see.
And I wanted to ask you, Ari. I mean, because this is like I said, our first time in a couple years really reconnecting. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. I talked about it. You are a sports writer and assistant manager at the Rio Grande Sun in Espanola, New Mexico. Obviously, we crossed paths in the Northwoods League back in the summer of 2018. I was with the Lacrosse Loggers in Wisconsin. You were with the Duluth Huskies in Minnesota. We obviously were in the same division, and so we faced each other and met a few times. Tanner Hoops, one of your colleagues, and Mitch Speltz are two guys I've had on the podcast previously. So it's
Right.
good to reconnect with you. But how did you end up from the Northwoods League in New Mexico being a sports writer and assistant managing editor?
Well, I think you have some idea how it is when you're looking for an introduction job and applying to anything that you can find that's sports writer position. And all of a sudden, I got a call from the publisher, and I went on from the publisher in Espanola, New Mexico, and after giving my resume to Indeed.com, and you go on Google Maps, and I say, okay, this place looks kind of nice. There's a movie theater, there's some restaurants. Let's give it a shot. And I've had a really good time. So a lot of high school sports. People in New Mexico, especially this part of New Mexico, go absolutely crazy about high school basketball. Um, you could go to a game in a small town, and there's thousands of people at a game. Um, and yeah, fights break out. It gets a little crazy sometimes, but that part of it's really fun. And we're right in the middle of basketball season right now. I was just at a pretty crazy game last night that went down to the last minute.
And I wanted to ask you too. I mean, we're finally an hour into this podcast, and I have a chance to finally ask you about, our time together in the Northwoods League. I remember lacrosse and Duluth having some great battles. I enjoyed going to Duluth to call a game. I mean, it was a nice historic stadium built in the 30s. You kind of had us out up in the stands, kind of in that area back there near the press box, and obviously you had a chance to travel in the Northwoods League as well. So you think about your time in that league. What are some memories that stand out to you?
Yeah, and I remember, some of the battles with lacrosse. Well, didn't we have like a 14 inning game or
Yeah.
15 innings one of those nights? And I remember they started slow and then were very quickly the team that you didn't want to play. A lot of guys with some incredible talent. And yeah, I had so much fun. Some of the people we met there, and Duluth, I think it was a little different that there was such like an intern culture, and there were about 15 or 20 interns doing broadcasting and game day operations and analytics. Um, oh, and the other one I remember is Braden Ward. I think he was with you, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and he was,
speedster.
I think the best player I saw that whole summer, and I was surprised that he hasn't gotten further in his career. And he also had always had his biggest games against us and was just completely unstoppable.
Yeah. What about like the road trips and stuff? I mean, is there anyone was there a road trip you really enjoyed, a
I
place you
do
really enjoyed
remember
visiting?
one road trip in particular. It was right at the end of the year. Zach Penrice and I were on this long road trip that was going to end the regular season. We went from Waterloo, Iowa to Bismarck, North Dakota, which I think was an 11-hour drive, and we left a little bit too late. So we pulled up to Bismarck for the second to last game of the regular season at about 5 o'clock. So the gates are already open. The first pitch is about 30 minutes. So that didn't go great. And we actually ended up staying there for the first playoff game. So we were already on the road. So we stayed in Bismarck. Then we went back to won that game by like a ton. It was incredible. Then went to Wilmer, Minnesota, won that game, also fantastic. Then went out to championship series for the first game. So we went out to, I don't remember. Now I'm trying to remember where was it? Eau Claire, Wisconsin? Not Eau Claire.
Fond du Lac, I think.
Yeah, Fond du Lac near Oshkosh. Um, and then it finally got to go back home. It was like a 12-day trip. So that was all pretty wild.
And did you have a favorite ballpark? I mean, I know I'm biased, but I always thought lacrosse was, in terms of traveling, one of the best ballparks to visit because the fan base was always there and very passionate fan base. So Duluth for me was up there as well. But did you have a favorite ballpark you like traveling to and calling a game?
I really liked Duluth. We sort of rotated the road trips, so I think I only went to each one like once or twice. I just loved the way that Duluth was set up right on the lake. You had like the lake behind center field. It had sort of that perfect temperature in the evening. Some nice nights with the wind coming off the lake. Lacrosse was definitely a fun one. It sort of always had a kind of rowdy atmosphere among the biggest in. Attendance, I remember, was always a big thing.
Laurie, this has been such a pleasure getting to catch up with you and not only reminisce about our time in the Northwoods League together, but talk about the NFL playoffs and make our predictions and talk about all kinds of things, including your Miami Dolphins. Thanks so much for joining me. It's been such a pleasure getting to catch up with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I hope you're doing well, and really appreciate catching up with you.
Well, thank you so much to Ari Levin, a sports writer and assistant managing editor at the Rio Grande Sun in Española, New Mexico. Again, we overlapped during our time together in the Northwoods League 6 years ago, believe it or not, now in the summer of 2018. Thanks so much to Ari for joining me on the latest edition of the Post with BP. Enjoy the NFL playoffs, everyone. We'll see you next time.